I was in the hospital when my brother made the biggest mistake of his life. He rushed to sell our parents' house thinking I was too weak to stop him. The paperwork was signed. The buyers were lined up. The celebration had already begun. What he didn't realize was that the house had legally been mine for weeks. I woke to the sterile smell of antiseptic and the relentless beep of machines. My head throbbed, my vision blurred, and for a moment the world felt entirely foreign. The last thing I remembered was the sharp pain in my chest and the ambulance ride. Now, I was staring at the white ceiling of a hospital room, tubes running into my arm, monitors tracking every heartbeat. Hospitals are strange places. Everything is quiet yet loud, routine yet terrifying. Visitors whisper in the hallway. Nurses glide past in precise choreography. Time doesn't exist here. Minutes stretch, blending into hours, and in the silence, fear grows louder. I tried to move, but my body refused to cooperate. My phone sat on the bedside table, vibrating intermittently. I reached for it, fumbling against the weakness, and saw a flurry of missed calls and messages. One stood out, my lawyer's name. "Mr. Anderson, urgent. Call me as soon as you can regarding your parents' property." The words made my stomach drop. Property issues? The hospital had left me disoriented, but this was different. Personal, immediate, dangerous. I called back, my fingers trembling. The line clicked. Anderson's voice was tight, professional and alarmed. "Listen, I don't know how to break this gently. While you were in the hospital, your brother initiated the sale of your parents' house." Time stopped. My heartbeat echoed in my ears. "What do you mean? He can't just—" "He did. He filed the paperwork this morning. It's complicated, legally binding. You need to act fast if you want to stop it." I sank back against the hospital bed, the sterile sheet suddenly suffocating. My brother. My own blood. Always the charming, persuasive one, the one who smiled while plotting behind your back. I had known he was ambitious, maybe even a little reckless, but this was something else entirely. I thought back to childhood. We'd fought over toys, over chores, over who got to sit in the front seat on family trips. But family property, that had always been sacred. The old house, the one my parents had poured decades into, held more than just memories. It held legacy, history, everything we grew up with. And he had dared to put it on the line while I was unconscious. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to call him right now and tear him apart over the phone. But my body refused. My mind raced faster than I could speak. How could he do this? Why would he even consider it? Did he know I was hospitalized? Had he been waiting for this moment? I remembered the last conversation I had with him. Casual, almost affectionate. Nothing hinting at the storm that was about to hit. He'd smiled, clapped me on the shoulder, and joked about checking on the house while I was busy with work. I'd laughed, unsuspecting. And now, I felt like a fool. Anderson continued, his voice breaking through my spiraling thoughts. "You need to know, the paperwork is nearly complete. He's banking on you being unable to respond quickly. But there may still be time. I can contest the sale, but I'll need any documentation proving your claim to the property." My mind raced. Proof? Claims? How could I fight him while lying here, recovering? The idea of my brother taking advantage of my vulnerability, of trying to rewrite history while I couldn't defend it, sent a chill down my spine. I looked around the hospital room, the rhythmic beeping of the monitors suddenly feeling like a countdown. Minutes were slipping by. Every second could matter. And in that moment, a chilling thought took hold. My brother had always been clever, always opportunistic, and now he had chosen the perfect moment, my weakness, to strike. I clenched my fists, trying to steady my shaking hands. Fear mixed with anger, creating a strange, burning clarity. This wasn't just about property anymore. This was about betrayal, about trust shattered by blood. And I realized that whatever move I made next had to be precise, calculated, and above all, quick. As I stared at the ceiling, the white fluorescent lights reflecting off the polished metal rails of my bed, I could almost hear him laughing, smug, triumphant, believing he had outmaneuvered me. I never imagined he'd try to sell our parents' house while I was unconscious. The first few days after leaving the hospital were a haze of medicine, exhaustion, and quiet reflection. My body ached in ways I didn't expect, but it was the mind that refused to rest. Sleep came in fits, and even when I closed my eyes, my thoughts raced back to my brother. His face appeared in my mind, always smiling, always calculating, always thinking 2 steps ahead. And now I had proof that his ambition could cross into betrayal. I decided to check my mail, hoping for something mundane, bills, advertisements, anything that would remind me that life still moved forward outside hospital walls. But when I opened the mailbox, my heart dropped. There it was, a thick envelope from a local real estate office, stamped and official. My hands shook as I slid it open. Inside was a flurry of documents, printed with sterile precision, each page more damning than the last. The listing, my parents' house, my brother's name on every form as the initiating party. My eyes blurred over the words, property sale notification, listing effective immediately, authorized signatory, brother's name. I couldn't breathe. I read the documents again and again. It had actually happened. He had listed the house for sale. He had done it while I was in the hospital, while I was physically vulnerable and mentally unprepared, trusting that he wouldn't cross a line. Or so I had believed. The kitchen faded around me, the sunlight streaming through the blinds, the hum of distant traffic, even the aroma of coffee. None of it registered. All I could see was the paper in my hands, my brother's signature like a knife twisting in my gut. Anger bubbled first, sharp and hot. How could he do this? My brother, my blood, my family. Betrayal had never felt so precise, so methodical. Then came disbelief. No, this couldn't be real. He couldn't. But the documents didn't lie. Every signature, every stamp, every detail pointed to the same terrifying truth. He had acted. I sank into the nearest chair, my mind a storm of conflicting emotions. My parents' house wasn't just a building. It was a lifetime of memories, every corner imbued with their love, their laughter, their sacrifices. And he wanted to sell it as if it were just another asset, another transaction. My fingers traced the edges of the papers as I tried to steady myself. The logical part of my brain started running calculations, timelines, legal implications, potential obstacles, possible delays. But another part, raw and instinctive, screamed, "How could he do this to family?" I remembered the little details from my hospital stay, the way he had called, supposedly checking in, always so charming, so casual. Every phone call, every message now seemed tainted. The smile I had trusted, the jokes we had shared, even the concerned tones, all part of a performance designed to mask his true intentions. The documents hinted at the next steps, inspections scheduled, buyer inquiries already lined up. Every piece of the plan had been executed with meticulous care. He had assumed I would be incapacitated, that I would be slow to respond, and that his timing was perfect. I closed my eyes and took a deep, shuddering breath. Fear crept in, the fear of losing everything, of watching helplessly as my family's legacy was erased. But beneath it, another emotion surfaced: determination. I remembered something I had done weeks before, quietly, in the lull between work and life obligations. Something I had set in motion long before my brother even imagined it. Something that, if leveraged correctly, could change the game entirely. My heart began to race with a mixture of exhilaration and disbelief. The power had shifted in a way he could never suspect. He thought he had the upper hand. He thought I was vulnerable, powerless, still recovering from surgery, still weak. But he had no idea. I looked down at the papers once more, my fingers tightening around them. The realization settled in, cold and sharp. He had walked right into a trap of his own making. Every step he had taken, every call he had made, every signature he had penned, now had a completely different meaning in light of what I had quietly prepared. And then, with a clarity that sent a chill down my spine, I whispered to myself, half in disbelief, half in grim satisfaction. But little did he know, I had already made a move he could never undo. The room seemed to shrink around me as I imagined the confrontation to come. The documents in my hands were no longer a source of fear. They were a puzzle piece, a catalyst, a weapon, one that would change everything. And in that moment I understood one undeniable truth. The game had just begun. The hospital stay had been temporary, my weakness fleeting. But the consequences of what had already been done would echo far beyond these walls. The betrayal was real. The anger was real. The stakes were enormous, but so was the advantage that only I knew about. And now, the countdown to revenge had begun. There are moments in life when preparation looks like paranoia, until it becomes survival. As I sat at my kitchen table, the real estate papers spread out before me. My mind drifted back to a decision I had made weeks earlier. At the time, it hadn't felt dramatic. It hadn't felt urgent. It had simply felt necessary. My parents' house had always been a point of quiet tension between my brother and me. He talked about it like an asset. I talked about it like a responsibility. After our parents passed, I noticed how often he brought up options, how frequently he mentioned selling, downsizing, liquidating. Always casually, always with a smile. That was when something in me shifted. I hadn't confronted him. I hadn't warned him. I didn't even mention it to friends. Instead, I did what I'd learned to do over a lifetime of hard lessons. I protected myself quietly. I contacted my attorney, not my brother's lawyer, not the family firm, mine. We reviewed the will. We reviewed probate records. We reviewed the trust documents my parents had put in place years earlier, documents my brother clearly hadn't read as closely as he thought he had. The house had been left to both of us in equal interest, but with a clause that allowed one heir to assume full ownership if the other formally relinquished responsibility. And that was the opening. My brother had always been impatient. He hated paperwork. He hated long processes. When I framed it as a temporary administrative move, something to simplify insurance, taxes, and maintenance, he didn't question it. He signed the waiver electronically during one of his many business trips, barely skimming the language. That signature changed everything. Within 48 hours, the deed was transferred into my name alone, filed, recorded, sealed, quietly entered into the county records with no announcements, no fanfare, and no alerts sent to anyone who wasn't legally required to know, including my brother. By the time I was admitted to the hospital, the house was already mine. Sitting there now, replaying the timeline in my head, I felt something unexpected rise in my chest. Not triumph, not relief, satisfaction, cold, controlled, earned. He had thought he was clever. He had thought timing was on his side. He had mistaken my silence for ignorance, my restraint for weakness. And now he was building an entire plan on a foundation that didn't exist anymore. I picked up my phone and opened my email. There it was. A message forwarded from a mutual acquaintance. Photos attached. A celebratory dinner. Champagne glasses raised. My brother grinning ear to ear across a polished restaurant table. The caption read, "Big moves coming soon. Can't wait to close." I stared at the screen longer than I should have. He was celebrating. Celebrating a sale he didn't have the legal right to complete. Toasting a future that had already slipped through his fingers. Telling people about a win that would never arrive. The anticipation settled in slowly, like a storm forming on the horizon. I didn't rush. I didn't call him. I didn't correct him. There was power in letting him believe the story he'd written for himself. Every day that passed brought us closer to the moment of reckoning, the inspection date, the buyer's walkthrough, the scheduled closing. Each step moved forward without resistance, without interruption. On paper, everything looked normal, efficient, professional. Behind the scenes, however, it was a countdown. I imagined the moment he would receive the call from the title company. The confusion, the denial, the frantic attempt to explain how this must be a mistake. I imagined his voice tightening, his confidence cracking as the truth became unavoidable. But for now, he didn't know. He texted me once casually, asking how my recovery was going. I responded politely, briefly. I wished him well with the house situation. He replied with a thumbs-up emoji. That small gesture told me everything I needed to know. He still thought he was winning. I folded the real estate documents neatly and placed them back into the envelope, setting it aside like a secret weapon. There would be time for explanations later, time for confrontation, time for consequences. For now, patience was my greatest advantage. I poured myself a glass of water and stood by the window, watching the afternoon light stretch across the street. Somewhere, my brother was laughing, making plans, counting money that wasn't his. And I watched it all unfold with calm certainty. Because I knew something he didn't. I watched as he celebrated his victory, not knowing it was already too late. The call came at 9:14 a.m. I was sitting at the kitchen table, the same one where our parents used to argue over crossword puzzles and weekend plans. My coffee had gone cold, untouched, as I waited. I didn't have to check the caller ID, I already knew. The phone rang again. I answered calmly. "What did you do?" My brother's voice was tight, stripped of its usual confidence. No greeting, no charm, just panic leaking through controlled fury. "I'm not sure what you mean," I said evenly. "The title company just called. They're saying there's a problem with the deed. They're saying I'm not the owner." His breath hitched. "That's not possible." I leaned back in my chair, letting the silence stretch longer than necessary. "It's very possible," I replied. There it was, the moment his fantasy collapsed. "You went behind my back," he snapped. "You knew I was handling the sale." "I knew you were attempting to," I corrected. "Those are two very different things." The line went dead. 37 minutes later, his car pulled into my driveway. He didn't knock. The front door flew open hard enough to rattle the frame. He stormed inside like he still owned the place, like he still owned the story. His face was flushed, eyes wild, phone clenched in his hand like evidence he didn't understand. "You manipulated me," he said, pacing the living room. "You tricked me into signing those documents." I remained seated. "No," I said calmly. "I gave you exactly what you asked for, less responsibility." That stopped him. He turned slowly, disbelief flashing across his face. "You planned this?" "I protected myself," I said. "There's a difference." He laughed, sharp, brittle. "You were in the hospital. You were weak. You knew I'd take over." I looked at him then, really looked at him. The brother I grew up with was gone. In his place stood someone who believed opportunity justified betrayal. "You thought my illness made me irrelevant," I said quietly. "You thought you could move fast enough that I wouldn't notice." His jaw clenched. "You always were afraid of being left behind," I continued. "So you tried to push me out first." He slammed his phone onto the table. "The buyers are furious. The bank's asking questions. Do you have any idea what this is costing me?" I stood up for the first time. "That," I said, meeting his eyes, "is exactly what you never asked yourself about me." The room went still. I walked to the cabinet and pulled out the manila envelope. Slowly, deliberately. I laid it on the table between us like a verdict. "The deed transfer," I said. "Filed weeks ago, recorded with the county, legally binding." His hands trembled as he flipped through the papers. "You can't do this," he whispered. "I already did." Anger surged through him then, raw and uncontrolled. "You robbed me." "No," I replied. "I stopped you from robbing our parents' legacy." He looked up, eyes glossy now, something like regret finally seeping through the cracks. "You were always the favorite," he muttered. "They trusted you more." I exhaled slowly. They trusted the person who didn't see them as a payout. Silence filled the room, heavy with everything we'd never said. "You embarrassed me," he said finally. "You ruined everything." I shook my head. "You ruined it the moment you tried to sell something that wasn't yours." His shoulders sagged. For the first time, he looked small. "What are you going to do now?" he asked. I gathered the papers and slid them back into the envelope. "That depends," I said, "on how honest you're willing to be next." He swallowed hard, because there was more he didn't know yet. More consequences waiting. Legal ones, personal ones, decisions I hadn't shared. I opened the front door and stepped aside. "You should go," I said, "before this gets worse." He hesitated, then walked past me without another word. As his car disappeared down the street, I closed the door slowly and leaned against it, my heart pounding. Not with anger, but with resolve. The confrontation was over, but the reckoning had only just begun. In the days that followed the confrontation, the house felt different. Not emptier, not quieter, just honest. For the first time since our parents passed, the walls weren't holding secrets. The tension that had lived in the corners, unspoken expectations, silent resentments, unfinished arguments, finally had somewhere to go. And when my brother left that afternoon, he took more than his anger with him. He took the illusion that family loyalty was automatic. I didn't hear from him again for weeks. The sale collapsed officially 3 days later. The buyers withdrew. The bank closed the file. The real estate office issued a carefully worded apology and refunded all fees. On paper, it was clean and uneventful. No lawsuits, no courtroom drama, just signatures reversing signatures like erasing chalk from a board. But emotionally, nothing about it was simple. I walked through the house room by room, touching the door frames my father had installed himself. The windows, my mother insisted, face the garden. Every creak in the floorboards felt like a memory asking to be acknowledged. This place had survived decades of laughter, grief, arguments, and reconciliation. It deserved better than to be sold behind someone's back. I thought a lot about trust, how fragile it is, and how easily it's mistaken for obligation. I had trusted my brother because we shared blood, because history made it easier to assume loyalty than to question motives. But trust, I learned, isn't inherited. It's earned. And once broken, it doesn't return just because someone says, "I'm sorry." When When he finally did reach out, the message was short. I didn't think you'd fight back. I didn't think you cared that much. I read it twice. Then I set the phone down. Because the truth was, I did care. I just didn't announce it. I didn't argue or threaten or posture. I protected what mattered quietly, before anyone thought they needed to protect it from me. That realization brought something unexpected: peace. The house is mine now, legally and emotionally. I updated the locks, I reorganized the paperwork, I revised my will. Everything is documented, transparent, and impossible to twist. There are no gray areas left to exploit. Some people might call that cold. I call it clarity. Family dynamics are complicated. Love doesn't disappear just because trust fractures. I still remember my brother as the kid who scraped his knees learning to ride a bike, the teenager who borrowed my jacket without asking, the man who toasted our parents at Thanksgiving. But I also see him clearly now. Someone who let greed speak louder than loyalty. That doesn't make him evil, it makes him human. And understanding that helped me let go of the anger faster than I expected. Justice doesn't always arrive with apologies or dramatic confessions. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in the form of consequences that simply stand. The sale didn't go through. The house remained where it belonged. The plan failed. That was enough. I didn't need to punish him. I didn't need revenge. The truth had done the work for me. One afternoon, I sat on the back porch as the sun dipped behind the trees, the same way my father used to after long days of work. I realized something then. The house wasn't just property. It was proof that patience, foresight, and restraint could still win in a world that rewards speed and noise. I had been underestimated, and that, ironically, became my greatest advantage. If there's anything this experience taught me, it's this: power doesn't always come from confrontation. It comes from preparation, from knowing when to speak and when to stay silent, from making moves before anyone realizes the game has begun. Family will test you in ways strangers never could. They know your weaknesses. They know where you came from. And sometimes they assume that means they know what you'll tolerate. They're not always right. I locked the front door that evening and stood for a moment in the quiet, listening to the house settle. It felt safe, grounded, protected. And for the first time in a long while, so did I. Sometimes the quietest moves have the loudest impact. By the time the sun came up, I already knew the answer. Not all of it, not the details, but the shape of it. This wasn't about curiosity, it wasn't about protection, and it definitely wasn't about love. It was about leverage. People don't go this far unless they're desperate, or greedy enough to justify it. I sat at the kitchen table with a yellow notepad and wrote down everything I knew: dates, calls, access points, money, behavior. When you strip emotion away, patterns become impossible to ignore. 6 months ago, someone insisted on helping with my computer and internet. 2 weeks ago, a forged power of attorney attempt. Days later, a loan application using my property as collateral, then the tracker. Then the panic when the data stopped making sense. This wasn't surveillance for safety, it was preparation. Someone needed control over my movements, my finances, and my decisions, without my consent, and they needed it fast. I didn't want to believe the name that kept surfacing, so I tested it. I made one phone call, casual, innocent. I mentioned, offhand, that I was thinking about updating my will. Maybe simplifying things. Maybe naming an executor sooner rather than later. There was a pause on the other end. Too long. "Why would you do that now?" they asked. There it was, not concern, not curiosity, fear. That reaction told me everything. Because if your intentions are clean, someone else's paperwork doesn't threaten you. But if you're counting on time, silence, or incapacity, any change to the plan feels dangerous. I didn't accuse, I didn't confront, I listened. The next day, I spoke with my lawyer again, quietly, carefully. I asked him to walk me through what would happen if that forged power of attorney had gone through. He didn't sugarcoat it. They would have controlled your finances, he said. Your medical decisions, your property. You could have been declared unfit without ever knowing why. And the car? I asked. He looked at me for a moment. Accidents happen all the time. That was the moment the emotional weight finally landed. This wasn't just betrayal. It was premeditated. Someone I trusted had decided that my life was an obstacle, that my independence was inconvenient, that my death or silence would solve a problem. And the hardest part wasn't the money. It was realizing how calmly it had all been planned. I had 3 choices: confront them, expose them, or trap them. Confrontation would only drive things underground. Exposure without proof would make me look paranoid, and running would mean giving up everything I'd built. So I chose the third option. I did nothing. At least, that's what it looked like. I let the remote access software keep running. I let the silence stretch. I let them believe they still had control. Behind the scenes, I locked everything down legally. New passwords, new documents, safeguards they wouldn't see until it was too late. I documented every call, every reaction, every slip of the tongue. I became predictable on purpose. Predictability makes people careless. Eventually, the calls slowed, the urgency faded. Whoever was behind it thought they'd dodge the problem, that the old man had calmed down, that the system still worked. That's when people make mistakes. I won't tell you yet how it ends. Not because I don't want to, but because this part is still unfolding, and some endings are better witnessed than explained. What I will say is this: when someone is willing to monitor your life, manipulate your finances, and install a device that could end everything with the push of a button, it's never about love. It's about control. And control, once exposed, has a way of collapsing in on itself. If you're watching this and something feels familiar, if someone in your life is suddenly very interested in where you go, what you sign, or what happens if something were to go wrong, pay attention. Because the signs are always there. And the hardest part wasn't realizing I was being watched. It was realizing who was willing to let me